session, which will begin with a series of TED Talks from climate activists from a variety of faith traditions. Then we'll move into conversation among the panelists, among all of us, and then we'll separate out into smaller groups for more focused conversations. I am so thrilled to see such a large gathering of people here today, and I'm thrilled especially that people come from so many different contexts: students, staff people, faculty here, activists in many, many faith communities and organizations throughout the area. I am excited about the potential we have to build alliances, to develop relationships of mutual support, and to hold one another accountable and inspired in all of the work that we do. Before I begin introducing our speakers, I do want to join in the many expressions of thanks for Leslie McPherson-Artinian. This conference is her brainchild. She has worked diligently for many years to take the wonderful work that Roy and Ralph have done in anchoring the environmental practices of the Divinity School and connecting those to the research and teaching that people in the faculty do, their exploration and learning that students do, and the actual institutional change that all of us are responsible for contributing to. It's Leslie's vision that holds these together here, and we're very grateful. Thank you. I guess with that, I will start introducing our speakers. I will introduce each of them in turn, so you'll have who they are fresh in your mind. So our first speaker is Dr. Willa Miller, right here on my left. Willa is currently the visiting lecturer on Buddhist ministry here at Harvard Divinity School. As many of you know, we have a deep commitment to Buddhist ministry here, and Willa is participating in the alliances that make that possible. She's a Lama in the Kagyu tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, founder and spiritual director of Natural Dharma Fellowship here in Boston, and its retreat center, Wonderwell Mountain Refuge in Springfield, New Hampshire. She's the author of 3 books, Everyday Dharma, Essence of Ambrosia, and The Arts of Contemplative Care. So a real leader in the emerging field of ministerial formation in the Buddhist tradition. This year she organized and hosted an Eco-Dharma conference, bringing together 35 teachers and practitioners from every major school of Buddhism to discuss the issue of global warming. Willa.
Thank you, Dan. I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to be with this community of good and caring people at Harvard Divinity School today. It is a joy and a privilege to be among those who care so deeply about our beautiful and endangered planet and its inhabitants, the winged, hoofed, clawed, scaled, and finned creatures who share these ecosystems with us. The gathering in this room is an expression of what the world needs today. Small communities coming together to discuss this critical issue that affects us all: climate change and environmental degradation. But this gathering is not only about discussion, it is about metabolizing the truth, feeling together, and finding mutual support and empowerment in the face of a critical global emergency. It is about leaning into the truth together and thinking deeply about what we can do. I do believe it is these kinds of gatherings, the possibility of thinking deeply together in community, that yield the most promise for changing the world. We cannot go it alone. This is the time to connect, to discuss, and to process in community. It is the time to make a commitment to a sane and sustainable life that leaves a legacy of real care for our children and for our grandchildren. In the few minutes that I have here, I want to talk about what I think religion might bring to the table when it comes to supporting a more sustainable world. The most critical environmental issue we face on this planet today is global warming. Global warming threatens entire species. It threatens the balance of our oceans. It threatens our ecosystems, our entire natural world, and it even puts the human future itself in peril. When we think about the causes of global warming, we turn to the assessment of systems thinkers and analysts and discover a list that looks something like this: reliance on fossil fuels, consumer culture, corporations, population growth, global alienation, and inability to connect and unite between countries, capitalism, social denial, a mass unwillingness to face the facts, lack of prioritization by the public and political leaders. This list is doubtless incomplete, but it gives us some idea of what the analysts are thinking and saying. When we look at a list like this, the forces we are up against seem massive, and the solutions posited are consummate in scale: reliance on sustainable energy sources, placing a tax on carbon, massive cooperation between nations, the passing of laws restricting factory emissions, and so forth. Massive systemic change is what is needed. The forces at play are huge and multidimensional. They require massive cooperation between nations, cities, countries, educational institutions, individuals, and corporations. This problem-solution model focuses primarily on externals. Because there are massive external challenges, the solution, it seems, must also be massive and external. I'm not here to debate this point, because I think it is obvious that global change will involve the externals, and that is deeply desirable. What I would like to challenge is that these solutions are all that is needed. If the root cause of global warming were due to the failure or limitations of our external infrastructures, then external solutions alone might work. But what if the massive external breakdown of our planet was also a symptom of something else, a pattern that is deeply personal, entrenched in the human DNA, or if you prefer, the human heart? When I try to imagine how the Buddha would have looked at the climate crisis if he were alive, I imagine he would have looked deeply into the human psyche. The Buddha traced human suffering, including societal suffering, to deeply entrenched psychological roots. He identified 3 of these: desire, aggression, and ignorance, which give rise to close cousins, greed, fear, and apathy, and many other complex human mind states such as jealousy, pride, and doubt. So in all, identified 52 of these. What I'd like to note about this is simply that the Buddha, were he alive today, would consider interiority. I would venture to say that all religions have this in common. They encourage processes of exploring the inner life and draw on the resource and strength of the human heart, our thoughts and our emotions, to create a pro-social interiority. So what do we, as religions or spiritual practitioners and leaders, have to contribute? Well, for one, we have to contribute processes of exploring the inner life, interiority. So we can begin to think about, if you are a religious leader, how are you encouraging people to engage in the inner life? Or if you're a practitioner or a spiritual practitioner, then how are you engaging in your interiority with respect to this issue? Second, ethics. All religions have ethical systems and sets of values. So from the perspective of that, as religious practitioners and also as leaders, we can encourage ourselves and our community to think deeply about our values and our ethics with regard to our relationship to the earth and its ecosystems. We can even think about bringing in ecosystems. Maybe our system of ethics doesn't include that, so how can we bring that in? How can we include it in some conscious way? Third, religions engage in liturgy and in ritual. Aspirations are powerful. Rituals are powerful. They're symbolic acts. Demonstrating in the street or engaging in nonviolent action are also symbolic acts. So we can begin to think about how are we engaging in ritual and liturgy in our community, and how might that connect to this issue. Perhaps we bring our congregation into the temple of the natural world now and then, or perhaps we engage in peaceful demonstrations. I think my time is up. Close? Yes. Okay, thank you. Oh, thank you. And fourth, we might think about our theology. We live a life of ideas, and in religion and in spiritual traditions, we explore the nature of the truth. So what truths are we including in our discourses within our community? Do those truths include a relationship to climate change? So to sum up, what I'm introducing to this panel is simply the idea that perhaps, 1, we need a global shift. 2, this shift cannot be merely about actions, collective or individual. 3, what is needed for a sustainable future includes a cognitive and emotional shift, a shift in how we understand ourselves, how we understand our relationship to others, how we understand and feel about the natural world. And 4th, what we need is not just a paradigm shift, but a shift of consciousness. Spirituality and religion have long played a part in the formation of human values, the stance of the human heart towards community and compassion, the possibility for a transformation of the self on an interior level. This role is not a minor one. Spirituality has the potential to catalyze a shift of consciousness, a shift towards greater love for our planet, an increased awareness of our interdependence, a respect for the sacredness of life, and the grit to enact real change. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Rabbi Shoshana Friedman, who teaches at Boston's Jewish Community Day School and is rabbi in residence at Congregation Shirat Hayam in Swampscott, Massachusetts. She is also a singer-songwriter who issued her first album, Guest House, last year, and a medical clown with the Hearts and Noses Hospital Clown Troupe. In all these activities, she seeks to bring hope, resilience, and Jewish tradition to bear on the global ecological crisis. Rabbi Friedman.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here. I want to open with a brief song. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav used to say, "Friends, do not despair. When a difficult time has come upon us, joy must fill the air. We must not lose our faith in living. We must not despair. When a difficult time is upon us, joy must fill the air." Wait, too much to say. Thank you. Thank you. When I was a child, singing this song in synagogue gave me great hope. And I hear it now as a clear call to keep joy and hope alive in the midst of this crisis that we're facing. We must not lose our faith in living. We cannot despair. And a difficult time is indeed upon us, so joy must fill the air. I want to highlight three of the hopefully many gifts, but highlight three of the gifts that Judaism has to bring to the table of interfaith climate change work. And these three are a lot of experience with paradigm shifts, the connection between the environment and human action, and the Jewish cycle of time, specifically the cycle of rest and renewal. So, paradigm shifts. When the Second Temple was destroyed by Rome long ago in 70 of the Common Era, the Jewish community suffered catastrophic violence and the loss of the way of life. And in the chaos, a man named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was smuggled out of burning Jerusalem in a coffin. Thus safely out, he brokered a deal with the Romans to give the Jews a place called Yavne in the land of Israel, and Rabbinic Judaism was born. Out of the ruins, Judaism took death, the coffin, and somehow made it part of the plan to survive. Whether after the destruction of the temples, the expulsion from Spain, emancipation in modernity, the tragedy of the Shoah, the Holocaust, or the founding of Israel, the Jewish people have had to reinvent how we live while maintaining integrity with who we are over and over and over again. We have had to radically rethink ourselves and our conditions of living. What does it look like to live an entirely new way, to relate to community in a new way, to relate to land, material resources, people who are not in our group in a new way? I'm so delighted to follow a revered Buddhist teacher because I wanted to bring in this little story that in the 1990s, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, recognized that his people were facing a dramatic cultural, religious, and political challenge in exile, and he brought a group of Jews to advise him. He called on us as experts in continuity in crisis. And now we, as a human collective, have our own deeply challenging crisis of continuity. And if we can rise to this challenge of paradigm shift, I believe, and in a deeply spiritual way, absolutely, of course, we have a much better chance of survival. One of the recommendations that this group gave to the Dalai Lama was to incorporate rituals that keep people connected to the land of Tibet. And indeed, Judaism understands and affirms that there is a deep and visceral connection between human actions and the well-being of the land. In our daily liturgy, we read from Deuteronomy chapter 11. Some synagogues are uncomfortable with the overt language of divine reward and punishment, and they omit the passage. But many of us, and I encourage us here to do so, read it as a clarion call to sustainable living. A translation by beloved teacher Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, may his memory be a blessing, is particularly attuned to this idea, and I'll read a part of his translation of this text. God says to Israel, "When you really listen and hear my directions, your earthly needs will be met at the right time, appropriate to the season. You will reap what you planted for your delight and health. Also, your animals will have ample feed. All of you will eat and be content. But be careful. Watch out. Don't let your cravings delude you. Don't let your cravings become your gods. Don't debase yourself to them. Because the God sense within you will become distorted. Heaven will be shut to you. Grace will not descend. Earth not yield her produce. Your rushing will destroy you. And earth will not be able to recover her good balance in which God's gifts manifest. Therefore, Hashem, God says, may these values of mine reside in your hearts and souls so that you will be more aware of them, and you and your children may live heavenly days right here on this earth. The land of Israel, like the modern Middle East, lived on the ecological edge. This text came out of a land where the right rains in the right times would lead to abundance, but drought could lead to starvation. The topsoil was thin, Yearly harvests were uncertain. Yet this vulnerability gave rise to a tradition with great wisdom and respect for the thin balance that is to live well on a piece of land. If we are in right relationship to our natural world, spiritually as well as materially, then our weather will support our needs. And if we are out of balance, it has drastic consequences for us, our children, for non-human creatures. When I read this paragraph now, I don't think of geographic Israel, though certainly she is in grave danger from climate change, but I think of our whole planet. The vulnerable weather that the Torah speaks of has now expanded to the whole world, and it has, of course, never been so clear how our actions impact the weather. In Judaism, the cycle of land and the cycles of time are intimately connected. My teacher, Rabbi Dr. Nehemiah Polin, teaches what he calls the Shabbat dance, and the dance goes like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest. Repeat, forever. In the creation story in Genesis, God dances this dance. 6 days of creating, and the 7th day, God rests. And while God does it on a mythic, cosmic time scale, and however we understand time in our mythology, we people count days. 6 days of working, and on Shabbat, which comes from the Hebrew root that means to cease, we just stop it all, and we rest. Shabbat is a time to refrain from purchasing, from travel, from stress, from technology. And in our fast-paced consumer age, she is an important Jewish offering to the environmental tool set. But we actually can't stop anymore at Shabbat. The Torah teaches that land also rests, that land does the Shabbat rest every 7 years during the Shemitah, or sabbatical year. Shemitah comes from the Hebrew root to release. And the most recent Shemitah actually started this past Rosh Hashanah, this past Jewish New Year, in mid-September. Biblically, it's a time when debts were forgiven, land was not cultivated, and radically, anyone could harvest what they needed for the day from anywhere, including so-called private property. But the contemporary environmental Jewish community has been re-envisioning what the sabbatical year could mean to us today. So many ideas have come out, and so many interesting events and initiatives have started. Sustainable agriculture, reconnecting to local watersheds and landscapes, sharing economy, where people do skill shares, working for economic and environmental justice. All of these ideas, we need to bring Shemitah values to life in a modern world, and not just during the sabbatical year, but of course, all the time. And I love that this dance of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, rest. I love that this dance is danced by God in our creation story, by people on a weekly basis, and by the land on a yearly cycle. This dance and the fact that we, divine and nature, are all doing it is one way of asserting so strongly in our tradition that we are so connected and in sync in these sacred rhythms. I will conclude with a teaching from an early Jewish rabbi recorded in a text almost 2,000 years old. It is the best metaphoric description of our global situation that I have read yet. Rabbi Tarfon said, "The day is short. The task is abundant. The laborers are lazy. The wages are great, and the master of the house is insistent. It is not up to you to finish the task, but neither are you free to desist from it." And I'm going to read that one more time. Rabbi Tarfon said, "The day is short, the task is abundant, the laborers are lazy, the wages are great, and the holy master of the house is insistent. It is not up to us to finish the task, and neither are we free to desist from it." Thank you.
Our next speaker is speaking to us remotely. He is Munjed Murad. Oddly enough, the person speaking remotely is one of the people who's lodged right here. Munjed is a Doctor of Theology candidate here at Harvard, studying comparative theology with Frank Clooney. His particular area of focus is Muslim and Christian approaches to the environment, a topic he previously studied with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. This year, Munjed is coordinating a year-long lecture series on religion and the environment at the Center for the Study of World Religions. So keep your eyes open for the individual events that make up that series. Now, the magic of technology.
Hey, hello everybody. My name's Ralph DiFlorio. I am the Director of Operations here at the Harvard Divinity School on the first day of autumn. And I am with Munjed Murad. And Munjed is a student, a doctoral student here at the Divinity School. He's a junior fellow at the Study of World Religions. He's an Islamic scholar and also has an undergraduate degree or a master's degree from Yale University in forestry. So if there's ever been anybody that's well suited to talk about sustainability in religion, here we are. So I'd like to just have you talk a little bit about your journey from Yale and the forestry program to the Divinity School.
Yes, my interests at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and here at the Harvard Divinity School have been on religion and the environment. And it's unfortunate that I can't attend this conference. It addresses a topic that I'm dedicated to very much so in my academic career and outside of it. But I'm glad that I can be there in spirit and by video as well.
Yeah. And so with Islam and how it intersects with sustainability, could you talk a little bit about that, maybe the historical context and what it means today?
Yes. So Islam has always maintained a sacred view of nature.
Yeah.
The question of sustainability comes today because we aren't in a balance with nature. And the Islamic view of nature was always one of oneness, a oneness of the natural and of the supernatural together, no clear demarcation between the two. And sustainability comes about in that maintenance of a harmony between humanity, nature, by means of science and understanding God through nature.
So you feel like we've been a little bit disenfranchised from God through science? Is that the way things have progressed or regressed?
Well, yes, regress, that's a good word for it. So the sacred was always in nature for all traditions. That statement about there being no clear demarcation between the natural and the supernatural is quite applicable to pretty much all sacred traditions. It's a fascinating pattern that of the Buddhists of the East to the Native Americans of the West, no clear demarcation was held between the natural and the supernatural. You have some exceptions over history for good reason. But it's an interesting phenomenon, and only with, say, the Renaissance onwards do we see a divorce between the natural and the supernatural, and later a denial of the supernatural altogether. And that, I would posit, is at the heart of the environmental crisis today.
And one of your, I think, points that was really interesting for me to understand in your wonderful paper was there is a way back. There is a way with the climate crisis that we have to sort of refocus and get re-engaged with this connection between religion and the environment. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about that a little bit more.
Yes. Well, let's first address the problem. The problem is rooted in a worldview that no longer sees the sacred in nature, partly because it no longer sees the sacred at all. And in no longer seeing nature for its sacred qualities, no longer seeing it connected to the divine in any ways whatsoever, one cannot but treat it as physical property. And that you can see leads to a destructive worldview in which a tree no longer symbolizing transcendence, the absolute in its trunk and the infinite in its branches, no longer being that, but rather now a source of paper, aesthetic scenery, and so forth.
It's a commodity almost.
It becomes a commodity. You can see what that does, what would happen to nature on a civilizational scale. So the problem is rooted in a denial of the supernatural, of the sacred. And so a solution must involve a reintegration of the sacred into our worldview, into our understanding of what nature is. That's primarily it. That's the way of seeing things. That should be our thought process. That then should in turn inform our practices, which involves a sacred science of nature primarily, because the sciences today no longer compared to Babylonian astronomers, compared to Islamic chemists who at the same time were alchemists. Today, juxtaposed to then, there's no longer a recognition of the sacred and no longer a treatment of nature as the sacred. So we need a sacred science. Then, in addition to that, an active involvement from the part of churches, mosques, and so forth, religious communities, in things regarding the natural environment. Because if you leave it to those who have no religious affiliation, and there are strong and good contributions from them, but if you leave it to their hands alone, then you'll never get to the point of seeing the sacred in nature from the sacred, capital S's eyes.
Yeah, and so a lot of it is education and using Islam, in your case, as the traditional path to reconnect. And so that's a lot of work.
It is.
It's a lot of work.
It's a lot. It took a lot to get us here, and it will take us a lot to get back, if one can say. And let's say it is a lot, but it is all necessary.
Yeah.
It's a lot, but it's necessary.
Yeah, we're all in this together.
Yes. And it's quite doable. It starts, first of all, with just seeing and understanding things differently, one step at a time. It's not that hard of a process.
Hopefully we'll get there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is the Reverend Margaret Bullitt-Jonas, PhD, who has 25 years of experience as a parish priest and spiritual director, and now serves the Episcopal Diocese of Western Massachusetts as Missioner for Creation Care. She serves on the board of Better Future Project, a nonprofit dedicated to growing a grassroots movement to address the climate crisis. Her most recent book, Joy of Heaven to Earth Come Down, is a collection of daily meditations on the sacredness of the natural world for use in Advent and Christmas time. Margaret is particularly interested in how spiritual practices such as contemplative prayer support our intention to be agents of healing and justice in the world. She's taught courses on this topic and prayer more broadly at the Episcopal Divinity School just down the street here in Cambridge. Margaret. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I get to see the trees, these symbols of the transcendent. When we think about climate change, we often focus on the outer landscape, such as how the rising level of greenhouse gases affects the planet's oceans and continents, its animals, plants, and human societies. Gazing at the landscape outside us, we know that the news is grim. The web of life is unraveling. As Bill McKibben succinctly puts it, our old familiar globe is suddenly melting, drying, acidifying, flooding, and burning in ways that no human has ever seen. What about our inner landscape? How are we doing? That's the question that interests me here. Given what we know about the crisis in which we find ourselves, what happens to the emotional and spiritual dimension of our lives? How do we face our fear and grief without being overwhelmed? How do we move out of denial and despair into a life that is filled with purpose and even joy? What will sustain our spirits as we struggle to sustain the earth? And you know, we need people, we need lots of people who are willing to face and able to face the most challenging, even devastating facts. People who are learning how to enlarge their reserves of courage, faith, and hope. People who will step out to bear witness in very concrete ways to the God in whom we live and move and have our being, and who entrusted the world to our care. So, here, briefly, is a 3-part framework for the heart, a way of holding the climate crisis in a way that helps us to respond wisely and creatively to the challenges we face. I'll sketch a spiritual journey in which we cultivate an awakened heart, a broken heart, and a radiant heart. We begin with an awakened heart. What is an awakened heart? It is a heart that is more and more deeply, more and more frequently, more and more consciously attuned to love. A person with an awakened heart is someone whose heart is repeatedly touched by a boundless love that seems to well up from nowhere, or that unexpectedly shines out from the world around. A person with an awakened heart is someone who is learning to see themselves and others and all creation with eyes of love in each and every moment. That's when we perceive the beauty and the preciousness of God's creation, and we experience gratefulness, wonder, amazement, awe. We discover how cherished we are as creatures that are part of creation. Experiencing and claiming our God-given preciousness is a powerful antidote to the messages we hear that human beings are a cancer on the planet, a virus taking down life. And you know, I understand the anger and the deep frustration behind such statements. The anger that is evoked by the enormous damage that humans are doing to the ecosystems on which all life depends. And it's true that our industrial economy, based on fossil fuels, is acting like a cancer that takes down life. But the only way forward is not to feed the voice of self-hatred, but instead to listen to the inner voice of love that is always sounding in our hearts and that alone can guide us to a new path. As I see it, all the world's religious practices, from mindfulness meditation to practicing gratitude, are disciplines we've been given to help our hearts awaken. As we walk forward with awakened hearts, we experience a broken heart, And of course, none of us wants to move into this second stage of the journey. And there are many reasons we fear and repress our grief. As Joanna Macy, the Buddhist eco-philosopher, points out, we don't want to feel pain. We don't want to look morbid. We don't want to bring other people down. We don't want to seem weak or emotional, sentimental. And yet we do feel pain for the world. We can't help it. No one is exempt from it because we're part of the whole. And suffering in one place ripples across the planet. So, as you consider the suffering caused by climate change, where do you feel the grief? What are the tears that you need to shed? What is breaking your heart? And how do we open to the pain of our precious world without drowning in it? The divine love in which we participate does not close itself off from suffering, but enters it and shares it and touches it with love. For Christians, the symbol of that divine sharing in our suffering is the cross of Christ. So, as a Christian, I go in prayer to the cross. I believe there that everything in us, all our pain, our anger, our grief, our guilt, all of it is perpetually being met by the mercy and love of God. One way or another, all the world's spiritual traditions teach us that there is no escape from suffering, and that paradoxically, a broken heart can be the gateway to hope and even joy. Now comes the third part of this spiritual framework. Filled with love, because day by day our heart is awakened, and wide open to our suffering and the suffering of the world, we want the love that is flowing into our lives to pour out into the world around us. We've been cultivating an awakened heart. We are accepting a broken heart. And now we want to express what I'm calling a radiant heart. We want our lives to bear witness in tangible ways to the love that has set us free. And what you and I feel sent out to do can take many forms. Commitment to care for the earth will affect what we buy and what we refuse to buy, what we drive and what we refuse to drive, how we heat our homes, how much we reuse and recycle, how ardently we join hands with other people to push for the enormous systemic changes that are required if we're going to save life as it has evolved on this planet. Yet just because we're very busy doesn't necessarily mean that we're manifesting a radiant heart. I gotta say. Maybe it's just me, but for example, sometimes I get super busy because I've lost touch with my basic preciousness. I think that I must prove my worth and demonstrate my value. And then I say to myself, Margaret, remember that you're cultivating an awakened heart. Let yourself rest in God's goodness. Breathe in God's love. Recall how loved you already are, and let that energy carry you into the next moment. Or, I get busy because I want to stay one step ahead of my feelings. I don't want to feel the pain or grief. I would much rather keep moving. Then I say to myself, Margaret, remember that you've accepted a broken heart. Go back to the cross of Christ. Let yourself stop for a while and bring whatever you're feeling to the loving God. everything in you, like it or not, is being met by love. When we know that we're cherished to the core, and when our anguish is met again and again and again by the ever-merciful love of God, then our actions are more likely to spring from wisdom than from fear or compulsion. And we live with a new sense of spaciousness and freedom without being attached to results. Attending to our inner landscape while we tend to the outer landscape can heal our souls and our communities, as well as the earth itself. Thank you.
Our next speaker is the Reverend Dr. Jim Antal, a seasoned parish minister who served congregations in both Massachusetts and Ohio, and since 2006, the minister and president of the Massachusetts Conference of the United Church of Christ. Jim has been an environmental activist since the first Earth Day in 1970, and most recently was the lead author of the United Church of Christ's divestment resolution, which passed in July of 2013. Jim also has a long history of civil disobedience, having served as executive secretary of the Fellowship of Reconciliation early in his career, and has recently participated in the White House action intended to stop the Keystone XL pipeline. Jim.
So like all of you, I've been to more events like this than I can count. And so often, what we focus on are the changes that the world out there has to make. And I'm a tireless advocate of those changes. But today I serve as a denominational leader. And so I want to spend a few moments focusing on what it might look like if the church, and by implication the synagogue, the mosque, and the temple, if we were to adopt a new vocation. In a moment, I'll share some headlines of what we might expect over the next 10 years if we were to pay attention to what I believe to be a new calling. But first, let me illustrate what I mean by talking about my personal shift in my own understanding of vocation. So I'm the leader of 370 UCC churches in Massachusetts. That's 820 ordained clergy and 68,000 individuals. And when I came to take this position, I said to the search committee and to the board of directors, I can't do this work in this day and age unless I'm spending, 5 or 10% of my time on climate change. And they didn't bat an eye. They said, we support you in that endeavor. And now that percentage is up to 20%, and I manifest that work on a national basis. Now, if this is true for me, it's not true because it's an idiosyncratic passion of mine. It's true because it's a scientific reality of our creation. So if it's true for me, it's true for all clergy. If it's true for all clergy, it's true for all houses of worship. And it's true for people of every faith perspective. So how might pastors live into this new vocation? Well, every time I meet with any group of our UCC pastors, I tell them that they should be at least touching upon climate change every third or fourth sermon, and they look at me like I have forgotten everything I ever learned in seminary. And then I say to them, if we as religious leaders don't do that, I don't know if it's 10 years, it won't be more than 15, every single sermon will be on grief. And the only need humanity will have for anything it calls God will be to engage in the grief process. So now, how might the church live into a new vocation? Here are some headlines of a new vocation I believe God is calling us to move into. Headline number 1, Christians abandon material and economic growth as the measure of meaning and success. So what if churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples began forming as laboratories of spiritual growth? And imagine if the impact of this was that society began to measure progress in terms of equal distribution of recycled material resources and increase in spiritual growth and happiness. Bhutan has already led the way on that. If you're politely thinking that this is some pie-in-the-sky kind of fantasy, imagine if leaders from all faith perspectives had engaged in a campaign like this in the mid-1970s to the same level that a very limited number of faith leaders engaged in the anti-abortion campaign at that time. Headline number 2. Coalition of Faith Communities launch civil disobedience campaign along pipelines and railroad tracks. The cost of discipleship seems to be getting more expensive as hundreds of thousands of people are gathering each week. But instead of calmly worshiping in their sanctuaries, they are blocking coal shipments as well as oil, gas, and pipeline construction. They are unified by a common love of God's creation and a common demand to end dependence on fossil fuel. Headline number 3. Christians now regard communal salvation on a par with personal salvation. What if Christians paid as much attention to those scriptures that emphasize communal salvation as they do to those passages that emphasize personal salvation? A theologian activist friend of mine put it this way: did Jesus come with an evacuation plan or a building plan? Here's one way this might work. Imagine churches, synagogues, mosques working together as advocacy centers for resilience and sustainable practices, town by town by town. Let's use the bell in the church steeple for its original purpose, to sound the alarm and rally the town in response to an emergency. It's time for the sleeping giant of the church, the synagogue, the mosque, and the temple to awaken to the challenge of our age. Headline number 4. Carbon tax passes due to lobbying efforts of churches. This could be the outcome of a lobbying campaign to expand the most basic moral instruction in the New Testament and in Hebrew Scripture, a moral instruction that is the foundation of every world religion. We are called to love our neighbors as ourselves, and on this new earth, we must recognize that future generations are no less our neighbors than the person sitting next door to you. I call this Golden Rule 2.0, and it's a straight line from that to a tax on carbon. Headline number 5. Churches convince Supreme Court to change laws governing fiduciaries. The root of the word fiduciary is being faithful to the future. The legal and investment world have teamed up as if they have exclusive rights to interpret society's understanding of fiduciary responsibility. It is both crazy and criminal to think that an investor has satisfied his or her fiduciary obligation by assuring maximum financial profit over the current quarter while ignoring that the investment, if that business carries out its business plan, will wreck the home of the investor. Headline number 6. Tens of thousands of churches launch truth and reconciliation commissions. The journey from the assumption that our call is to conquer, dominate, and exploit nature to seeking intergenerational and cross-species atonement will require a personal and communal, transparent, sacred conversation. As was the case in South Africa, houses of worship can initiate and lead such a healing and transformational process. Headline number 7. Supreme Court affirms doctrine of public trust. Nature can no longer be exploited for profit. Coalition of churches and children celebrate. As religious leaders began to take in the full meaning of the Anthropocene, they joined with a movement known as Our Children's Trust. You can Google that, Our Children's Trust, whose goal was to affirm the ancient doctrine of the public trust rooted in Roman law. In a similar vein, all over the world, religious leaders are engaged in conversation with proponents of land trusts, like Margaret, for example, launching a growing movement to place into trust land owned by houses of worship and religious institutions. Some are suggesting that the ownership of nature is not in keeping with religious teaching. So I look forward to seeing some of you in the breakout session where we'll be able to engage conversation around divestment and other material assets. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Our final speaker is Tim DeChristopher, a Master of Divinity student here at Harvard Divinity School, preparing for ministry in the Unitarian Universalist tradition. Tim is also Bidder 70, the activist who saved thousands of acres of public land from being exploited for fossil fuels simply by outbidding the big oil and gas companies. And he didn't outbid them because he was wealthier than they were. Tim spent 2 years in federal prison for his courageous act of civil disobedience. And before, during, and after his time in prison, he has inspired others to find their own ways to rise up peacefully against all the forces that would destroy our planet for profit. Tim.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Leslie, for pulling all these people together. I'm here today, I guess, representing a couple of traditions. One would be Unitarian Universalism that I'm preparing to enter into in the ministry. The other would be the climate movement, where I still sort of hold my main identity as a climate activist. And as Jim said, I've been involved in a lot of these kinds of conversations and a lot of these kind of conferences. And I'm currently working with the Unitarian Universalists on a national climate justice initiative that they're kicking off next spring called Commit to Respond. And I'm sure we'll discuss that more later on as we move on. But really the thing that drove me from the work that I was doing in the climate movement to coming here to Divinity School and to pursuing the ministry was the realization that we needed faith communities in the climate movement, and that we needed them not only in a superficial sort of way, but really as moral leaders in this movement, that the climate movement based in NGOs lacked moral leadership. And in a lot of these conversations and conferences like the recent one at Union Seminary that several of us were at last month, there is a growing awareness that climate change is a moral issue that religious institutions and religious leaders need to be tackling and engaging with in some way. But I feel like a lot of our religious communities still haven't answered the question of how and where we should be taking a stand on climate justice. And even in a lot of the engagement that we've seen so far from religious leaders and religious communities has been with the perspective that, yes, we're behind the climate movement. We're right there behind the climate justice movement. So if you need clergy to sign on to a letter, we'll sign on to that letter for you. If you need some photo ops with the collars out front, we'll be there for the photo ops. And even if you need people to get arrested, we will be there and we will get arrested. Just tell us what to do. But that perspective of just tell us what to do is not moral leadership. It's not what we really need from religious communities. And so to look at what we really need, I think we need to look at what the challenge is with climate justice. And despite our setting, I don't want to get into an academic discussion about what climate justice really means, but I think that one of the basic things that we can agree upon with that climate justice in part means keeping most of the fossil fuels in the ground. And most of those fossil fuels that are already proven reserves are actually on the asset books of fossil fuel companies. And there may be some way of keeping those assets in the ground and still giving those companies the profits that they expected when they made the massive investments in discovering those reserves. And there are actually people working on that. But the difference between the climate justice movement and other ways of engaging with the climate crisis is that the climate justice movement not only wants to keep those fossil fuels in the ground, but do so in a way that doesn't guarantee future profits to those who have already profited from exploitation. And so that's one of our fundamental perspectives here that is implicit in the challenge of climate justice, is that we actually intend on costing the richest and most powerful and most ruthless industry in the world trillions of dollars in lost future profits. Because their share price right now is based on the assumption that they will develop all of those proven reserves in fossil fuels. And they're still looking for more. ExxonMobil is still spending about $500 million a year looking for new fossil fuels in addition to all the proven reserves that we know we need to keep in the ground. So our goal is to prevent them from making those future profits that they're counting on, which means costing some of the individuals at the top of that industry, like the Koch brothers, billions of dollars in lost personal profits that they intend to make. So that's a rather large challenge, and I think it's worth pointing out with that challenge that this is an industry that has killed people for profit throughout its whole existence. In my home state of West Virginia, that has been developing fossil fuels longer than any other state in this country, people have died because of fossil fuels for the entire history of that industry. And West Virginia is now ranked as the least livable state in the country with the lowest life expectancy because of the impact of fossil fuels. And as we move towards new experimental, more destructive, more toxic forms of fossil fuels, like what comes out of fracking wells and tar sands mines, it's killing people even more, as we're seeing in places like Kalamazoo, Michigan, that is already suffering drastic effects and massive deaths because of the 2010 tar sands spill there. And since it's rather hard to convince people to voluntarily poison their own water or blow up their own backyards, the fossil fuel industry has also increasingly moved towards killing democracy in order to be able to continue killing people for profit, as we're seeing in places like Colorado, where local municipalities and towns have been passing bans on fracking, and the natural gas industry has moved in and lobbied the state to prevent local municipalities from having any say in what happens in their neighborhoods and eliminate local democracy. We're seeing similar pushes in Pennsylvania, where the industry has joined together with the police and the FBI to create sort of a shadow police force that deliberately intimidates anybody who speaks out against fracking in their neighborhoods. So this is our challenge, to overcome that kind of industry that has made it pretty clear that they are not going to willingly get out of the way and join us in our quest for a healthy and just future. So if we're going to stand in the way of that kind of systemic evil, we'd better be standing on pretty solid rock. And with this challenge of overcoming the fossil fuel industry, it's also exacerbated by the fact that we have to overcome that industry at a time of corporate ascendancy when both parties of our government have been completely bought out and co-opted by that industry and many other major corporations, when every branch of our government, including the regulatory agencies that are supposed to be keeping our communities safe, are prioritizing the profits of the fossil fuel industry over the lives of the people in this country and around the world. So that's a pretty big challenge for us. And it's further exacerbated by the fact that we don't get to meet that challenge in 1992, because it's not 1992 anymore. It's 2014, and we haven't been doing what we needed to be doing for the past generation. And so we no longer have the easy path before us where, even if we're as successful as we can possibly be at overcoming that industry, where we'll have the nice, healthy, peaceful world that we hope for in the future. We're at a point now where if we're as successful as we can possibly be, there will still be massive impacts and unprecedented hardship that we face in our future, probably at a catastrophic level. And so if history is any guide, as we go down that path of chaos and desperation, we can expect our leaders to do desperate things to try to cling to their power and to try to divide us against one another or scapegoat certain classes of people. So not only do we have to overcome that industry and its government pawns, but while we do it, we also have to dismantle classism and racism and sexism and xenophobia and homophobia and all the other things that pit us against one another and make us more vulnerable to climate change. I'm convinced that our greatest vulnerabilities to climate change are not low-lying cities or our water infrastructure. I think that our greatest vulnerability to climate change is those things like classism and racism and patriarchy that pit us against one another, that can lead us down a path of responding to crisis with fear rather than solidarity, responding with competition rather than cooperation. So that is our challenge right there. And if we want to stand in the way of that kind of systemic evil, we had better be standing on solid rock. And that, I think, is what faith communities are called to. Because if we look back at other struggles against injustice and against systemic evil, there have always been those periods where there's no reasonable expectation of winning. And I think a lot of the reason why the NGO climate movement hasn't been willing to tell some of the hard truths about what our real challenge is and what we're really up against is because their paradigm is that hope has to be based on optimism, that we have to have an outlook that things are going to be okay in order to motivate people to action. And that is actually probably the most disappointing way in which our faith communities have gotten behind the NGO climate movement instead of leading them, is accepting this mentality that the only kind of hope out there is optimism. At the Religions for the Earth conference that several of us were at recently with global religious leaders from around the world, there were several times where some of these major religious figures were up in front of this gathering and they were asked, where should we be basing our hope? Where do you base your hope off of? And they immediately answered along very similar lines of, well, we have to be optimistic. Ridiculous. That optimism is really our only choice. You just have to be optimistic and give people something positive to look forward to. And that was incredibly disappointing to see coming from religious leaders who are not called to be optimistic. We are called to be faithful. And that is what the religious communities need to be bringing to this challenge, is an awareness that we can be basing our hope off of faith, not off of optimism. Because we know that there will be points in this challenge where there will be significant backlash. If we're at all successful at wresting control of our systems away from the fossil fuel industry and other corporations, there will be tremendous backlash, and there will be tremendous personal sacrifices that will have to be made along that way. And if our past social movements are any indication, we know that there will be points where there is no reasonable expectation that we will win this struggle. And in those dark moments, we will have to continue the struggle for justice, not because we expect that things will be okay. In those dark moments, we will continue the struggle for climate justice because that's what it means to be faithful to a God who loves this world. We will continue this struggle because that's what it means to be faithful to the people that we love and to the world that we love. That is what we are called to bring. I'm convinced that faith communities are not called to the climate movement merely to provide some photo ops with collars out front.
All right.
Although Jim looks really good in the photo op.
Thank you. We as faith communities and as faith leaders are called to be the rock of this movement. And I ask, not rhetorically, but genuinely to guide the rest of our discussion, do our faith communities have what it takes to be the rock of the climate justice movement? Thank you.
Woo-hoo! So good. Well done.
Let's have another round of applause for our panel as a whole. Now we're going to move into a time of conversation. As I said, first among the panel, I have a few questions that I will pose to all of them, and then we'll open the floor for all of you to invite them into conversation on particular topics. And then Leslie will instruct us in our small group time at the end of the afternoon. So my first question for all of you is a chance perhaps to lift up things that you heard one another say, but perhaps also to bring in material from the partnerships and alliances that you're already involved in. What does your faith tradition hope to learn from other faith traditions? What are the things that you see other communities of faith doing that you would hope to bring more fully into your own community's work, specifically with regard to climate justice? You don't all need to speak,
In
but
three
several
words:
of you can.
Sabbath, mindfulness, and courage.
Okay. Good.
I'm not sure exactly how to put this, but there's a piece about being, though we've been a very successful minority in America, still being very much a minority and still having this sense of needing to self-protect that I think certainly leads to a lot of our lobbying in Washington. The organized Jewish community spends a lot of time lobbying on political issues relating to Israel and not as much time as I would like to see us lobbying around other issues, and part of that is a sense of vulnerability and needing to sort of rally around the flag. So I think one of the things we can learn is the need to dismantle all the isms and partnering with folks who are doing that kind of solidarity work so that there can be a little bit of a sense of a shmita, a release of the fear that despite our success we somehow communally still live in, so that we can really engage in the policy work as well as the education.
I'm feeling a need just to respond to kind of the energy of what we've been talking about, so I'm not really addressing your question.
It's okay, you're so nice that you can just do it.
I'm just not addressing that question. I feel confirmed in how I'm perceiving the moment, and I just really want to appreciate the folks who spoke here. Because I feel like we're called, it's a kind of a both and of, as Tim was saying, of being willing to step out in some bold way to be bearing witness to this rock, this truth that we experience. So it's a sort of bold, big and bold outwardly, but the only way to do that is to stay very grounded inwardly, as some of us were trying to communicate. It's this kind of both and of how to, this is where, to me, contemplative practice is powerful, because that's where we are willing to sit in the darkness, sit in the unknown, in the waiting, in the not yet, and I don't know what will be revealed, but it's a place of great trust. To have I'm just thinking of the power of having a practice of where we regularly sit in that place of unknowing and allow what is true to be true without my doing anything about it. Whether I like it or don't like it, it's here. And which to me gives a ground. From that place, we can then move out very boldly, I think. Anyway, I just find the whole combination of contemplation and action a very powerful dynamic that I think religion can offer and teach practices. Yeah.
Margaret actually just answered my second question. So all of you can pick up on that theme or the one before, or can continue to be rebellious.
Could you rephrase?
I'm going to go back to the one before. I think that what the Buddhist community can learn from many of your communities is unity and solidarity. And I think that just because of the nature of the history of Buddhism in this country, it's not like there's one Buddhist church. It's like there's 1,000 different Buddhist tiny little groups all over the country, not even speaking to each other, and that creates a real challenge to solidarity around this issue. But I think things are getting a little better. But I think that's what we could learn from some other traditions.
Yeah, so just to explain, the second question was how can the inner work and the outer work be mutually reinforcing? What does it mean to be sitting in a congressperson's office lobbying, say, as a way of deepening an inner sense of gratitude or Sabbath, and vice versa?
I think music is a really big piece, and can everyone hear me without the mic, more or less? And of course, we look to the civil rights movement for the most amazing example of that, and I want to see us as a movement really using the power of communal lifting of voices in actions, in marches, and before visiting with legislators, and maybe even in the room with them. I mean, it's just, it transforms space, it lifts vibrations, it opens our hearts, and it really brings people together in a way, I mean, we all know this, but in a way that talk and ideas don't get to us in the same vibrational level.
When you opened with song, I said to Tim, I said, the next time we go to jail, we need you in there.
Andrea and Fred.
That's right, that's right. And I said that because, in 2011, when I was part of the first wave of a whole bunch of people that got arrested, over 1,200 people got arrested. But the first 63 folks on the first day, we all got thrown in jail for 3 days and nights. And the problem is that there weren't many of us who were religious. And so as a consequence, sharing songs that are customary within religious circles was something, at least, that I, in my collar, didn't want to impose. Also, I can't sing very well. Now, if you had been there, I'm sure you would have had an array of songs that we could have sung that would have been much more universal, and you do that a whole lot better than UCCs and other, explicitly Christian denominations. But it's so essential. What you said is just so true.
To me, this really speaks to something I haven't yet articulated, but it's how to be engaged in this struggle without demonizing.
Yes.
And that to me is a key, and I don't have an answer to that because we're definitely in a struggle. We're definitely in a struggle. But who's the enemy? That's the question. And to me, the path forward as I'm trying to embody and teach is a nonviolent path. I feel like that's a really big conversation the climate movement will have to keep having.
I just want to build on this and explain one of those headlines about a Truth and Reconciliation communion. So I was speaking to our UCC churches, believe it or not, we have some in Texas, Mississippi, and Arkansas at their annual meeting, and I was their speaker. And in the morning, it was just pastors only, closed door, complete candor. The most prominent pastor in Houston, stood up and it's like the room got still, like, fireworks. And she said, Jim, my church is located in downtown Houston, 2 miles from our church. ExxonMobil is building their new world headquarters. Within 2 or 3 years, 90% of my collection plate and pledges will come from ExxonMobil. Would you please comment? This is a great story, right? So I rock back, and I have to connect it with another story, and that is when the UCC passed the divestment resolution that several months before that, I wrote a number of people who I had emails for, and Desmond Tutu wrote me back. And he came to me at that moment. And I leaned forward, and my eyes got really big, and I said to her, you and we need to initiate a truth and reconciliation conversation. And I had no idea what that meant, except what Margaret was just talking about and what all of you are thinking right now, which is impossible, right? How is it I wanted to invite Rex Tillerson to come and hear me speak at that meeting, and then I realized he was actually in Dallas and he wasn't in Houston, so I didn't extend the invitation. But my dad worked for 43 years for Mobil Oil. He was their chief chemical engineer. I believe this conversation is the work of the church, and if we are a rock, the way Tim talks about us, and it's a long reach, at least from most of the churches that I'm affiliated with, it's a long reach from where we are to where we need to be. I couldn't agree with you more. Then we can do this kind of truth and reconciliation conversation and realize in a non-blaming way we can all move together to the world God is calling us to build.
So I'll weigh in on that with several things that Jim and Margaret just made me think about. First is that my dad also spent his whole career in the natural gas industry, like Jim. And I mean, he also considers himself an environmentalist. I would consider him an environmentalist as well. So I do recognize that it's not bad people, and that's why I specifically said structural evil that we're up against here. So I think one of the ways to avoid demonizing is to keep that focus on what the structures are that is keeping up the status quo, not about changing individual minds, at least not in positions of power, but it's about tackling those structures. When you were talking about Desmond Tutu, that also made me think about the question of how we do the internal work and the external work as well. I spent a good bit of time this year with a Jesuit priest named Father John Deere, who had just come back from spending some time with Desmond Tutu. And when he met Tutu, the first thing Tutu said was, John, you're going to have to keep struggling for peace your whole life. You're going to have to keep doing this work your whole life. And John said, how do you do that? How do I do that? How do you keep doing this difficult of work for your whole life? And Tutu said, I cry every day when I think about the suffering in the world. And I feel that. And every day I laugh when I look at all the beauty in the world and all the things that I'm so grateful for. And I think that kind of practice of looking fully at the suffering in the world and looking fully at the joy and the beauty in the world gives us the kind of grounding that we need to do the kind of work then that we need to do out in the world.
I'm gonna take up with that. I think that's another area where bringing together spiritual life and contemplative life with activism can be very, very ripe. Someone like Desmond Tutu can look at the suffering of the world and cry, and he somehow metabolizes it in a way that allows him to continue to do it again and again and again. And I think one of the issues that at least I face in my own congregation, I'm sure other people do as well, is the tendency of people to want to turn away from this issue. It's painful to think about, it's painful to look at the truth. And so in terms of practices for metabolizing this suffering, I think is where religious leaders can help support a sustainable activism, one that doesn't burn out after a month or 2 months, or doesn't even get going because it's too difficult to look it in the face.
I have one more question before we'll open it up, and this builds on what some of the things that Jim was saying about the particular institutional changes that have happened in his community and the further institutional changes he'd like to see. So I wonder if the rest of you could share some thoughts about inspiring ways in which religious traditions have transformed themselves at the institutional structural level, and also the ways in which you might hope that your institutions would inspire and challenge educational institutions like Harvard to engage in similar structural transformations.
I can start on that because I feel like it's somewhat obvious in some of what I'm doing with the Unitarian Universalists nationally on their Commit to Respond program that they're launching next year, which is a joint effort between the Unitarian Universalist Association, the UU Service Committee, the UU College of Social Justice, and many other national organizations, where they're taking a month, and they actually borrowed this model from the UCC, where they're taking a month next spring and just focusing on climate justice with all of those organizations. They're clearing their slate of everything else. And that month is designed to be a period of making commitments, both individuals and congregations, of making commitments of what they're going to do for the next 2 years in regards to climate justice. And those commitments were pushing folks into making commitments across all three different sort of legs of climate justice, which are shifting emissions, advancing human rights for impacted and marginalized communities, and growing the movement, growing the capacity to change. A lot of the work that UUs have already been doing, which sort of allows them to like pat themselves on the back and think, oh, we must be done, is in that shifting emissions part of it. A lot of changes in consumer habits and that sort of thing. And as part of my work for that campaign, I've been listening to as many UU sermons on climate change as I could over the past few months. And I've been getting mixed results. I'd say for every sermon of real prophetic truth, I've had to listen to probably 10 different variations of green consumerism. And so that's sort of like the easy entry into this where a lot of our congregations have been. And so the push that we're doing now is get people out of that consumer mentality, recognize that is good work that needs to continue being done of changing our emissions, but we also need to be engaging in the structural change work of being in solidarity with marginalized communities and really growing the capacity of a movement that can actually start to change power structures in this country.
I want to take the question and maybe do a little bit of a drash on it, a little bit of a different take on it. Across the board, the Jewish community has seen this huge increase in outdoor environmental and food education that I just want to lift up, because while it's not directly in the lobbying and the structural change, it is really in the building capacity of those three. So there's a center out in Connecticut, Isabella Friedman, that has Hazon, which is a national Jewish environmental organization, and they have groups of day school Jewish students, and my 6th graders are actually on their way tomorrow for their trip to Teva, which means nature, and so many young Jewish kids are going and getting to spend a week doing hands-on environmental education with trained educators, and that turns into young adults who are going and doing the farming intensive at the same center, which turns into this whole movement of people who really have their hands in the ground and are certainly inspired around the policy work, and also just that sustainable spirit piece of getting our hands into soil and into into husbandry, land husbandry, so that the political work and in the buildings and with the suits on is really funded by our hands being on the ground that we are working for. So I just want to lift that up as a big success. I think that I would love to know more about other places or other traditions that are doing similar things, or cross-pollination, so to speak.
Well, this isn't really answering the question yet again. I just feel very in process in the Episcopal Church. I began my position in the Diocese of Western Massachusetts last January, and it's been so much fun. I was always afraid when I stepped into the pulpit in my parish church, it was like, oh, here goes Margaret again talking about climate change. So now my job is I get to travel around to different churches and I get to preach about climate change. So I feel like we're building a network in Western Massachusetts, I'm hoping, in the Episcopal Church. And last summer, the trustees of our diocese voted to divest from fossil fuels, and 2 weeks ago at our diocesan convention, our little diocese called on the Episcopal Church, the national church, at its meeting this coming summer, to make a commitment to divest from fossil fuels. So we're in the middle of that struggle as a body of faith. Where I'm feeling a lot of energy is around building collaborations with other. I love it when the climate justice movement or the climate movement meets up with the social justice movement. That's where I get excited. And in Springfield, out in Western Mass, it's the largest city in Massachusetts that had no climate action plan. And struggling inner city Springfield, it's just this desperately poor city that just voted, and now it's going to have a big casino in it. But a coalition of poor Latino and poor African American and immigrant communities came together for the first time. They got together saying this city needs a climate action plan. They got together on that in an absolutely new way. And then people from north, which is Amherst and Northampton, and we're all the sort of white, relatively wealthy, privileged folk, we came down to support them. So it was this wonderful coming together, had a march in Springfield just a couple weeks after the People's Climate March in New York, marched up to the steps of City Hall, had a rally and some speeches, went inside, including an enormous figure of Mother Earth who made her way inside as well, and asked the city council to pass a resolution to create a climate action plan for the city, which they unanimously did. And that was just this moment of hope of this is, the bad news is the climate crisis involves everyone, and the good news is we can, if we pull together and build unity and stay united, as Tim was saying, so much is possible. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to open this up to all of your questions. I will call on you. Leslie will come around with the microphone. Please tell us a little bit about who you are, but just a sentence or so, and please make your question as succinct as possible. You'll have lots of time to share your full stories in the breakout sessions. So, Antal? Yeah, so up here.
Wait, which way? Where are you pointing? Okay. Thank you. My name is Antje Danielson. I'm a director at the Tufts Institute of the Environment up in Tufts University. I would like to get back to the idea of ritual that I think two of you addressed. And I think one of you at least said that there's lots of rituals that connect people to land or to where they come from. But I'm wondering if ritual could also connect people and contribute to communication. And I was wondering what the different religions could do to maybe develop common rituals that will help us fight climate change.
I guess I've never heard a question that I don't want to respond to. I can't remember exactly when. I think it was about a year and a half ago. I was at one of these conferences, and I just had this crazy aha. and it relates to exactly what you're saying. The level of profound change that I think is needed, and why I use this phrase of a new vocation for the church, or repurposing, an even stronger phrase, repurposing the church, it goes in the direction of what your question is asking. So I would propose a new sacrament that would be an interfaith sacrament. I believe that's a direct answer to your question. And that obviously stirs up all of the sort of fundamental, the caretakers of sacramentology. They all rise to the surface all of a sudden, and they tell me why I'm so stupid and why I've forgotten all my theological education and all of that sort of stuff. But your question is begging exactly what's going on in my heart, which is we have denominated religion. And in fact, in the context of the holistic climate crisis, we realize that the religious impulse is something human beings have in common. We need a common sacrament through which that religious impulse could be expressed communally. That would be good too.
I'll say that the sanctuary song is huge in the Jewish community, and some people don't even know that it's not a Jewish song. Oh Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary. Huge. That's gotten in there.
One of the things I liked about your question was that you were talking about rituals that not just connect us to the earth, but connect us to people as well. And I think that's important because I do think connection to the earth is necessary, but certainly not sufficient. Rex Tillerson has a connection to the earth. He filed a lawsuit to stop fracking in his Texas vacation home. So he has a connection to his chunk of earth.
That's great.
He just can't connect that to the rest of humanity and to future generations. And so I think whatever rituals and sacraments that we use and connect with needs to connect us to the entire interconnected web of humanity and life, including future generations. I think perhaps one of the reasons why indigenous communities have been such strong leaders of the climate justice movement over the past few years is that their religious rituals do actually connect them to future generations. And I think a lot of our traditions don't have nearly enough of that.
Gentleman in the middle of the back row.
That was a great pull-out for Rex.
Thank you. I'm Chris Queen. I'm teaching a weekend course right before Earth Day next April, 17th to 19th, which you're all invited to take part in. It's called World Religions Face the Climate Crisis. So it's a simulation of a world's parliament of religions where we are tasked with breaking into religious traditions and writing protocols for governments and denominations as to how to deal with this before Earth Day, which will be the 30th Earth Day, is that right? The 27th?
No.
Yeah. Anyway, I have a question for the panel. It has to do with this inner-outer issue and the degree to which we can be specific in bearing witness or calling out those. We've mentioned Rex Tillerson several times now and ExxonMobil without demonizing and so on. And in terms of speech, this is what the Hebrew prophets actually were all about, saying, God is not happy with the things that are going on, and being quite specific about who God is not happy about. And in terms of rituals, we all sing and so on within our congregations, but if you were in New York for the Climate March, all of those meditators on the south end of Central Park that were sitting there quietly, right out in public, doing a religious ritual where everybody could see it in the context of activism. And finally, grounding and land. Maybe the Zion is Dryden, New York, and places that are threatened with fracking or tar sands excavation. That becomes the Zion that we need to worship and hold up as sacred, not necessarily the Benares or Jerusalem or those traditional places.
That's an idea.
Yeah, just about ritual. I also have been lately rethinking or like opening the possibility of rethinking about what ritual is and what it could be, especially given that in these contexts of interfaith situations, we're coming together with people of other traditions, and then how do we enact a ritual if we haven't made it up beforehand altogether? And this summer we had this gathering of Buddhists from many different traditions around this issue of climate change for an eco-Dharma conference. And on the Saturday night, we realized around the campfire that we didn't have a common ritual, because there were Zen Buddhists, and there were Tibetan Buddhists, and there were Theravadan Buddhists, and we didn't even have common languages necessarily. And what we did was enact a spontaneous ritual, and people began getting up and singing their particular song, their particular chant, and would get other people involved, and then that would transition into someone else getting up and doing the same thing with, just kind of figuring out on the spot how to enact an earth ritual that was about Dharma and sacredness of life, and also the earth. So, and it was very beautiful. We really, at the end of it, we all thought, this is what ritual can be. It can be spontaneous. So I'll just offer that by way of encouragement.
Betsy? Oh, no, this way, Leslie, in the red sweater. And there are a couple others who had their hands up next to you, Betsy, so you can just kind of pass it down.
Hi, I'm Betsy Sowers, and I just have a lot of feelings about being here today. And I'm an alumna of Harvard Divinity School, and it was here at this school that I learned in my bones the connection between faith and the rock of prophetic witness and faith, and how those things are connected. And that's one of the reasons that I've been involved in Divest Harvard from almost the beginning. So I wanted to say a little something and then have you guys comment on, because that's a very particular structural set of issues that can be addressed, and it's very close to home. And I know there's a number of folks here, and I hope a lot of students, some I see who are already involved in Divest Harvard, and the rest of you would like to really invite to talk to the rest of us who are here. I'm one of the 4 people who was banned from campus last spring for doing civil disobedience in Sanders Theater. My partner in crime, Wen, is over here. I don't know if Craig's here. And yeah, Craig didn't make it. That was very much rooted here, and it's just so ironic that then Harvard said, don't come back because you did something that was rooted in what you learned at Harvard. So I really think that and also that Harvard's leadership, we've been hearing in the Divest Harvard movement that other campuses and other investment committees of other colleges all around the country are waiting when they're asked to divest and saying, what's Harvard doing? So it's one piece of this huge thing that's going on, but it's a really important piece. I'm really thrilled that Harvard Divinity School is on board and doing this conference today, and I hope that will result in both this school and lots of other folks within the university getting on board with getting Harvard to divest. And I'd love for the panelists to say anything that ideas you have for spreading that out, and also people from other campuses here too, because this is all over.
I'll address that because I was involved with Divest Harvard for a little bit as well, and I think it's certainly a challenge. When you have $36 billion in the bank, you have a pretty strong vested interest in maintaining the status quo. So, Harvard has 36 billion reasons not to change anything. Their endowment increased by almost $4 billion just in the past year. So the status quo is treating them pretty well. So I think one obvious point in that is that in order for them to change and challenge the fossil fuel industry, it's going to have to be a really, really strong push. They're going to have no other alternative, which is why they've been even avoiding any discussion of it and avoiding any open dialogue that the students have been calling for a year and a half now. So that's part of it, that it'll be a big push, but one that I think is necessary and also doable. I mean, while Harvard is a intransigent institution, it's not quite as stuck in its ways as Congress is. So if we're going to change those larger institutions, we've got to be able to change this one as well. And so I think as many calls as we can have for them to at least engage in that open dialogue about it is a start. And then I think part of the reason they don't want to engage in that dialogue is they know they don't have much of a case to stand on. You know, in one of the last closed-door meetings that President Faust had with an activist from the divestment campaign, she responded to his request for divestment by saying, well, you know, it's a slippery slope. I mean, if we divest from fossil fuels, then what's next? Are people going to be asking us to divest from sugar because they use slave labor? I mean, are we going to be are they going to try to hold us accountable for the impacts of all of our investments? And, you know, we can debate the specific tactic of divestment in the case of fossil fuels, but generally the answer is, well, yeah, actually. We actually would like to hold Harvard accountable for the impacts of all of its investments. And that is what being a moral institution means, that you take responsibility for the consequences of your actions, and that if you don't want your investments to be political, you got to hide that money under the mattress. So it is a revolutionary ask that we're asking for. And so I think in our push for divestment, we need to acknowledge that too, that that we're actually pushing for major structural change here. And there are a lot of moral implications to it, and that it really is a threat to the status quo. You know, I think watering it down doesn't help. They know that it's a real threat. And so I think we need to be honest about that and be articulating as big of a vision as we can of a world in which institutions that have $36 billion in the bank have to take responsibility for the impacts of all those $36 billion in the global economy.
And I just want to add, with just a different accent to what Tim just said, you don't get to claim the moral high ground unless you're actually occupying it, right? So you know, 6 years ago, Fred and I and a couple of others organized a thing at Memorial Chapel here, and Bill McKibben came, and we tried our darndest to get Drew Faust to come, and of course, you know, she didn't come. And at that was going to be an opportunity, at least in my fantasy world, to say to her, just as I have said to pastors around preaching on climate change, it seems to me if Harvard claims to be a leadership institution in the educational field, every single course at Harvard would need to touch upon climate change. It is ridiculous to claim that you are teaching people who are going to be leaders in the world to come and not have faculty challenged intellectually to connect their historic capital of whatever their discipline might be with the current conditions and future prospects of the world, right? Seems like the most obvious thing in the world, right? And Harvard could be a leader in that regard, couldn't it? All right, I've said too much.
We're going to have a breakout session on, just to point out, we're going to have a breakout session on this later, which Jim is going to lead. So someone's going to make one brief comment, and then I want to move to other questions.
Kathy Buckley, involved with Fossil-Free MIT. I went to the MIT CoLab conference this morning. The final speaker was Jeremy Grantham of the Grantham Foundation, and he gave an incredible speech. I hope it's available, remarkable. And one of his comments was, of course, MIT is run by oil. And then he said, of course, I'm very busy, so I don't intend to be invited back again.
Hi, I'm Kitty Beer. I'm a Harvard grad and a Unitarian, and I now write novels about climate change. My question stems from the idea of who the enemy is, and a lot of you touched on that. I think it's a great idea not to demonize individuals or even corporations, although they are evil, but to realize that our enemy is our own culture, which I describe as being consumer capitalism. And the question when you accept that is, how the hell do you get people weaned from consumer capitalism? This is a job for the psychiatrists. And most of the panels that I go to have many, many experts, scientists of every stripe. But where are the psychologists and the sociologists and the psychiatrists who we need to help wean us from our very own culture?
Well, most of our top psychologists are working for the marketing industry. So that's where they are. So I think the job of weaning people off of consumerism is going to have to fall to our religious communities, which really we should be better at. I mean, I think all of our religious traditions have an implicit foundation that there is more to life than our material consumption. That the foundation of the reason that we're here is not to get rich and buy lots of stuff. So all of our religious communities should be providing an alternative foundation for fulfillment in life rather than material consumption. But beyond that, I think we have to look at what the weapon of that industry, of the marketing industry is, like how it is that they're able to push so many people into consumerism. And as far as I can tell, that weapon is the weapon of alienation, that it is alienating people from one another, from their communities, from their own values, from themselves, from their own self-identity. And I think perhaps even better than psychologists, religious communities are equipped to defend against alienation and to do that work of reconnection, of reconnecting people to one another, to their communities, to their values, and to their deepest selves. That is the work that religious communities need to be doing, and it's perhaps the most important work that we can do to fight climate change is fighting alienation.
I want to jump in and just add that, and I think this goes for the divestment question as well, that the acknowledgement of loss and the acknowledgement of what we are asking ourselves and others to give up is crucial. And to go into a meeting with someone who has billions of dollars on the line and acknowledge how scary it is to think about things differently I have not yet had the opportunity to be in a room with somebody with $36 billion, but I've had the opportunity to be in intimate relationships with people where the acknowledgement and compassion for what is on the line, even when we want to think, oh, they shouldn't have that much money to begin with, I feel angry that they have, let it go and get to the heart of what we're asking. And on the consumer piece, I just want to voice, I went to Oberlin College and we did a lot of learning there about remaking the way things are made and really using capitalism and the economy and the way that our incentive system works to the benefit of the environmental movement. So I just want to also say, I hesitate to make, even though our system is so broken, I still hesitate to make capitalism as itself the enemy, but certainly the way that it is functioning in the world right now is. But when we put the innovation and incentives in the right places, I think it can be an amazing ally in instigating and inspiring growth and innovation.
There's one more right by you, Leslie, and then we're going to take it up to the other aisle, because I know you've been waiting patiently up there.
Hi, I'm Katie Allen, and I'm a chaplain at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, and I'm also one of the co-conveners of the Jewish Climate Action Network in the Boston area. And one of the things that I think about in terms of coming to this as religious people is the role of the chaplain in the hospital. which is to sit and hold, and this kind of touches on a few things that different people have said, but we're small in number, but what we do is we sit and we hold the tension that people are in. And a very important part of what we do is we listen to people's stories. So in essence, there is the creation in a moment of a ritual. You listen to the story, you say a prayer, the person cries, the person finds the courage to keep going. And so I think stories are another piece that's really important in allowing people to tell their own stories. And the other thing is that the chaplain has a job when the doctors can't do anything else. The chaplain still is needed. The doctors say there's nothing more we can do, and the chaplain is there because there's never a time when it's too late to redefine your hope and to redefine what it is that you are looking for out of life. And so I think a lot of what our responsibility as religious leaders is to do is to hold the tension, hear the stories, and stand in the breach and allow people to cry and to just transform the moment through that sort of instantaneous ritual.
And may I just quickly add, thank you for that beautiful statement. I like to hold the sort of both andness of this moment of, as the web of life is unraveling right now, sometimes I imagine that we're being chaplains. Yeah. And I also like to imagine that we're being midwives, that we're allowing something new to be born. And we don't even know what it is yet, but we set our sights on that.
So Fred?
I'm Fred Small, Senior Minister at First Parish in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist. First, thank you to the panel and for those who convened the panel for invoking and provoking this amazing conversation. I want to say a quick word about demonization and then ask about electoral politics. First, demonization. In my congregation as a pastoral, as a parish minister, I often talk about accountability and compassion. They are not mutually exclusive. So I will oppose and call out the Koch brothers, but if you read Sons of Wichita, their biography, you will have compassion for them as people. They are children of God, and they must be stopped. Electoral politics. We didn't do very well as climate activists last Tuesday. Tom Steyer spent, $73 million and does not have a lot to show for it. We can do better. And it seems to me that religious activism is the sleeping giant in this realm, and it is still pretty much snoozing. As some of the panelists know, I'm in the early stages of organizing something called the Creation Coalition, to take a page from the book of the Christian Coalition, which I disagree with in almost every particular, but has been incredibly successful, and from black churches, which have been doing electoral work for a long time, very successfully, and say, why can't we take our prayer out of the sanctuary and into the voting booth and make a difference in Congress? Because they have a fair amount of power, and right now they're obviously not using it in a good way. So my question for the panelists is, do you see a role for people of faith not only to do the interior work, which is absolutely essential, and the work within our congregations to green them, which is essential, but also to make a difference in the realm of politics? And I just this morning thought of the phrase, to get our hands dirty, but only with clean dirt. In other words, to hold on to our center and not become our enemies, but to use the tools and instrumentalities of the world to make a difference in the world, and specifically in the political and electoral realm, with electricity.
So a quick and easy answer to this. I agree with everything Fred says and probably everything he's going to say. Is that this organization that I mentioned, our Children's Trust, one of their lawsuits is now just been submitted to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the United Church of Christ in Massachusetts is an amicus to that. And that was a unanimous vote by my board of directors. So yes, yes, and yes.
I think the technology of congregation-based community organizing can and should be employed even more than it is. We saw the success of that in healthcare in Massachusetts and all around the country in different campaigns that affect people, and sort of steering the congregations towards that kind of how we're impacted, why we care, and working on the local political issues, and not duplicating efforts, but working with the NGOs that are effectively have their feet on the ground. I really agree with you on the that we need to have more of a rock of the faith community and leading. And I would add, or the friendly amendment, that I don't want to reinvent any of the policy work that the people who really know how to do policy work are doing. I want to be able to piggyback, work with, and then have the results from the more people power of Citizens Climate Lobby, 350, all the people who are doing that.
I would just push back briefly
Sure.
to challenge the notion that any of the Washington-based climate movement knows how to do policy work effectively.
All right.
Or electoral politics. I mean, the progressives have been stuck on two electoral strategies, either voting for the lesser of two evils or not voting. And both of them have proven to be absolute failures because party loyalty is antithetical to political power for a movement. So I'd say that electoral politics is one of the biggest areas where the climate movement hasn't been very creative at all, and has bought a lot of really failed conventional wisdom about how change happens. So it's where we need new leadership.
Thank you.
I just want to say, I think the timing, Fred, of forming a creation coalition couldn't be better. To now have the party that's in charge of the House and the Senate, many of their votes demographically come from people of faith. So if we could lift up, this is what people of faith value, I think the timing is lovely.
Martin King used to refer to specific individuals, and the general population is vicious, racist. And if you've been following the Protestant lectionary the last couple of weeks, Jesus has been having a particularly joyful time whooping up on the Pharisees and scribes. And we know that people have died because of the irresponsible behavior of specific individuals. And we know more people are going to die. Our working assumption is that we're not going to die. And I want to assure you that I preach every Sunday and I demonize by name. If you want to know where the truth is spoken, see me afterwards. Thank you. Actually, I'm going to embarrass Jim Antal. I'm UCC, but I'm not right now serving a UCC chair.
I wanted to respond. My name's Ambrose Spencer. Thank you all for the work that you do. And
I can't hear you. We can't hear you.
I'll not waste time. I was at a sermon at Monday Lunch for Homeless where one of the homeless spoke about what parables are and what they're used for and what's at the foundation of them. Early in Jesus' ministry, sorry to be specific to just the Christian world, but it's the one that I'm more familiar with. At the early part of his ministry, he was not ready to be arrested and taken and killed, even though there were people in the organized church who were ready to do away with him. He was an embarrassment. He was getting people excited about God again. So parables are a way of telling a story which allows you to talk about what's actually happening structurally without naming people. Not everybody gets it first time around. It's like a cover story, but it's a cover story for God's purpose. And I just want to say that there's a way of demonizing that Jesus taught us and other prophets that we can draw from. We would be humble enough to realize that maybe it's not time for everyone to go to jail, but we surely need more people willing to do that.
Leslie, we've got one over here.
Thanks. My name's Eli Gerzon. I'm with the Better Future Project and the Jewish Climate Action Network. And touching upon this issue that a lot of people have brought up about demonizing. I actually, I don't mean this in a big way, but I had a little bit of a revelation just about over lunch talking with somebody actually about, he said he didn't like divestment because it's always talking about that as a moral issue, demonizing the fossil fuel industry. And I told him that it isn't sort of the main party line about divestment, but from my perspective, the way I often think about divestment is it's admitting we have a problem. We're addicted to fossil fuels. Divestment is admitting we have a problem. And I was really happy to hear that that was a framing that he could relate to. He's like, okay, we're not demonizing them, but we're saying we're addicted. We have a compulsion. And so exactly, when we talk about the Koch brothers, they have a compulsion to make money, and they must be stopped. And it's not placing a value judgment on it. So I just think that's a helpful framing, and people in my life, people even in the climate movement, in my family, like people who do things that are really upsetting, and I really don't think are good. But I think that they often have a compulsion. Again, talking about sort of the internal side to this, incorporating the work is, I think that people will do so much to avoid their own soul, to avoid the truth inside of them, and it's just amazing what people will do to avoid that. And so I think that keeping that compassion in mind, as we say, yeah, but no, we do have to stop them. So, yeah.
My name is Jay O'Hara, a Quaker and a sailmaker from Cape Cod. Couple of things that been brought up that I'm trying to tie together in my brain and would love to hear more about. Tim was talking about how the church has been following the lead of the NGOs and the environmental movement, and Jim's been talking about a new vocation. And I guess maybe this is the 350-year-old Quaker broken record of how do we deal with the church as a big NGO when we're stuck in paid vocations that have a really nice, 150-year or 200-year history or kind of lineage of what that is supposed to look like in our culture, and reconcile that with the church's prophetic history, and what does that new vocation look like?
Well, just a short comment on that. A friend of mine whose dad had been a pastor in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, and she then became a pastor, and I had the privilege to work with her. She said that her dad had this expression that I had never heard before. Maybe all of you have heard it, and that is that with some regularity, every once in a while, but with some regularity, any pastor worth their salt needs to preach a pack your bags sermon. And I would say, if you were all pastors in the UCC, I wouldn't hesitate to look you all in the eye and simply say, if you aren't preaching a pack your bag sermon at least a few times a year, then to your point, then what was it about vocation that you misunderstood? Did you just miss the course on the prophets? I mean, because yes, there is an institutional church, but the fact that there is an institutional church does not condemn the church to be faithless. in fact, it is possible for us to pay attention to the prophets and be faithful in exactly the way Tim and others have been talking about it.
I think it's also interesting to sort of as systems thinking, that I'm being paid by the church, but I get to sort of drop into different congregations and sort of preach my heart out, and then I leave. And then people can go, I mean, I sometimes get letters from people like, oh, I hate what you said. But mostly they can go complain to the rector, like, who's she? And then he can go, or she can go, whatever. But it stirs things up, and it's generating groups of people are coming together and seeing who each other are in the room who care about this, who never knew that other people in the congregation cared about this. I often ask these people, how many of you have heard a sermon about climate change? Raise your hand. And many people don't raise their hand. They haven't heard any sermons about it. Anyway, I think there are ways to work with it systemically to.
And I think it's also a matter of getting a critical mass, like hearing about your desire, I can take this job if I have 5 to 10% of my time for climate change. The more of us who are professionally doing this, who say, like, look, I need study time. I need to be able to be in my office to do my own study and my own devotional practice, and I need to be able to do my work for climate change or for whatever movement that we're working with, because I think it goes across movements. Then you point and you say, well, this rabbi also has a contract that says this, and this reverend has a contract that says that. And it starts to build a sense, well, of course, that's just what happens when you have clergy. And I think it really starts with getting the word out that this is happening, and it gets to become more status quo.
You go ahead, and then we'll take you.
Hi, I'm Vince Maraventano, Elliott Church in Newton UCC, and Executive Director of Mass Interfaith Power and Light. I would like to compliment Margaret in the Episcopal Diocese for that particular model. As much as I agree with Jim that preachers should preach pack their bag sermon, in thinking of your comment about the minister who's next to the Exxon headquarters, I have had that experience myself as a ministerial intern in the church, people begging for somebody to preach against the Iraq War, and a very outstanding minister reluctant to do that because we were in the shadow of a major defense industry, and she felt her primary obligation was pastoral care. And I do believe that the hardest changes are changes we make within ourselves, and that it is in fact easier to yell about bringing down the capitalist demons, although I am inclined to do that myself, than doing the interior work. And I think a better model is for people like Margaret and Jim and me to go into these churches and preach these sermons and allow the pastors to focus on nurturing the ability of the lay people to go out and do this hard work.
Jim, could you just say what a pack your bag sermon is? Because it just occurred to me, not everyone may know.
No idea.
Oh, it's just a sermon which will prompt the prominent people in the congregation, those who control the church either from the church council or from the parking lot, to simply say, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. This person has to go. We don't have contracts. This is an important interfaith dialogue here. Unlike rabbis, we don't have contracts. And actually, as a denominational leader, I'm the only one in the entire UCC that gets called year to year. Right? But I think that's, to your point, Jay, I mean, this is why you and I, when we first met, we've just been in sync with that's what faith leadership should always be. It should always be edgy. It should always be risky.
I'll just weigh in on that briefly about what it is that we're talking about with prophetic sermons and whether those inevitably drive you away or drive people away. And I'm going to have a workshop later about civil disobedience where we dig into the very many things that civil disobedience can offer. Near the top of my list for that is educational opportunities and getting people to actually listen in a different way than they otherwise would. So I would say that prophetic sermons go over far better when you're not telling people what they should do, but when you're explaining why you just did what you did. So that's the I think that's the important piece of prophetic religious leaders is that they're explaining why they're standing where they're standing and the way in which they're standing, more so than they're indicting anyone else.
Okay, we're going to go back around to this.
Okay.
So the woman in the blue sweater here.
Yep.
Hi, I just recently joined an outfit called Mothers Out Front, and I also went to New York, and what I learned from both of those experiences is that so much of life is about showing up and doing it consistently, and at my UCC church, one thing that I find difficult and I would like more education in is this piece of the pastor or whoever is speaking the truth, then to follow up and give the congregants the tools to join them in this transformation. And we have all of these truths that we hear more and more on the media that are fiction. How do we come up with a consistent talking point list so that guidelines so that we can feel empowered to stand our ground, our faith, our truth, because it's hard. It's very hard. And I think that a lot of us want to, but we just don't know how to go about it, and we don't have the words. So.
In my mind, you were talking about two very different things there. I mean, one, you were talking about a list of talking points, and in the other, you were talking about speaking your own personal truth. And I think those things are often in conflict, and I think part of where the NGO climate movement has gone wrong has been focusing on set talking points at the exclusion of our own personal truths. I think personal truths are much more powerful than talking points, because I think regardless of how well structured those talking points are, if there's somebody else's talking points, people are going to be able to tell. People know the difference between authenticity and somebody repeating someone else's talking points. So that personal truth actually has to come from within. Nobody can tell somebody what their personal truth is. And so I think rather than telling people what their personal truth is, I think our role as leaders is more often to create the space that invites out people's personal truth. And part of that is speaking our own personal truth, even if it's not what people want to hear at the moment, even if it might be one of those pack your bags sermons. I think that's part of what opens the space for others to share their personal truth. So I think it's more about creating the space for stories than telling people what stories they should be telling.
Really well said. That was good.
Can you hear me? My name's Elaine Marr, and I'm a Quaker, and I'm an alumna of the undergraduate college and the Kennedy School. And I have to tell you, right now I'm feeling really brokenhearted and not at all optimistic. And some of this goes back to, but very faithful, and some of this goes back to the earlier conversation about Divest Harvard and about being morally responsible for what the institution does. And this morning before I came here, I was very, very, very grateful to come here, but I was also thinking about my undergraduate education and my Kennedy School education and how much we focused on achievement and individual recognition, and how little spirituality there was at this institution overall, which began as a divinity school. So I guess what I bring to you right now is a question of how do we change the culture here? Because Shoshana, we didn't talk about remaking things when I was here.
Dan, do you want to win?
Oh, yeah. That was good. That was good. I go back to, I think you and Fred both were talking about the Koch brothers. I think the starting point is acknowledging how much pain there is to be in a place that has received so much in ways that were not just. The pain of all that will be lost as we move into a more just world. The pain of knowing that those of us who are connected to institutions of this sort can neither responsibly keep nor give up the power that we have. And I think we just really have to keep coming back to, again, what Fred was saying, that the need for pastoral care among the powerful is just as great as the need for pastoral care among the victims of the powerful, and that can never be separated from the need to call the powerful and those of us occupying powerful institutions to conversion, that we can hold ourselves and those who have even more power than ourselves accountable in a deeply compassionate way. That's the first step. I think there's also the step of really helping one another know when it's time to walk away, from powerful places, because there are people who are able to use the kind of power that resides in places like this in wonderfully creative ways, and there are people who are destroyed by places like this. That's just a fact, and all of us who occupy these spaces need to be aware of that and help one another sort out which is the case for ourselves.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. That was a hard question. Yeah, really good answer.
My name is Ann Goldman, and I wear many hats in this context, one of which is that tomorrow is the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts Convention, and I'm a delegate, and also the proud signer of a divestment resolution, which is similar to the one that Western Massachusetts did. But that's not really what I want to talk about. I was really caught when by two speakers, and I want to see if I can connect two comments. One is, I believe Rabbi Shoshana said, it is not up to us to finish the task, but we are not free to desist. And that really spoke to me.
The Mishnah said it, but I quoted it.
Did I quote it correctly?
Oh, you did, yes. It's just not my quote, but.
Well, you said that.
I said it in this context, please.
It always gives me comfort to know that it's not up to me to do the whole thing. Yeah. Just do my job. Mm-hmm. And God will worry about the whole of it. And that really, when I feel most discouraged, I think, yeah, but it's not up to me. It's just up to me to do what I'm supposed to do. But I want to tie that with what you said, what Tim said, and I'll probably misquote that too. We're not called to be optimistic, but called to be faithful. Yeah. And I think those are the two parts of the same story. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciated both those comments. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
No, just that I've heard that quote for a long time.
Mother Teresa.
I've heard that quote for a long time and had never connected it, so thank you. I think you're right. Those are connected.
I would love to just add one more quote, if you can stand it, which is from Helen Keller, and it just relates to what you were saying. Helen Keller said, "I am only one, but still I am one. And I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do."
She was quoting a Unitarian.
Is that true?
Yeah.
My name is Katrina, and I am a second-year MDiv here at HDS. And my question for the panelists is as follows. So I'm wondering what our vision is and what we're building towards. So I've heard a lot of discussion about who's wrong or what we can do in the moment. But my question is about why we want to even do this hard work. And in particular, what our religious traditions have to offer us in terms of a vision for what we want to work towards.
So I was just in a big visioning session last weekend, sponsored by Rainforest Action Network, of these things that they're doing around the country. And a lot of it focused on our vision of 2050, and they set up pretty strict guidelines in terms of, this doesn't have to be realistic. It's just like our best case scenario. So like the context of the vision is we've succeeded by 2050. Mm-hmm. And in 2050, they announced that we've done what was necessary to keep climate change under 2 degrees, that we've successfully made this transition. Now, what's your, how did this happen? What's the vision of what that world looks like? And I found that pretty unfulfilling, to only focus on a utopian vision, because I think that leads to a rather fragile kind of hope that is based on this utopian vision where we get everything that we want. We've got this ecotopia and we've solved all of our problems, which on some level we know is probably not going to happen. And so it makes it hard to hold on to that vision, and it sets up this kind of either-or dynamic where either we get this perfect utopia or we lose the end. Then there's nothing to fight for. But there's a whole lot of space between utopia and apocalypse. And I think that's where we need
and
more.
Here we are in it.
I think that's where we need more visions of what our continued struggle is going to be, because it will continue to be a struggle. We will still be imperfect people on the other side of the revolution that we need.
That's it. And
the closest thing to a promised land that is on the other side of that revolution is more revolution. And there will still be significant hardships. So, I could talk for a long time about what that vision might look like. But I think that's a vision of us responding to hardship by turning towards one another instead of against one another. A vision of much greater cooperation in the face of very real hardships. A vision of us holding each other and supporting each other holistically in communities in the face of very real suffering. So it's not a completely rosy vision, but it's a humane vision. Yeah. And I think that's the vision that we need to be holding on to more and lifting up more, is the vision of how do we hold on to our humanity down a path of very real struggles and hardships.
We really were just about at time. So, sorry, who's gonna?
I was just going to say, it doesn't matter. I was just going to say that this is the result of that kind of vision. This very room, that getting together and being willing to lean in and think deeply about these issues is an example of that. So I just wanted to, I think sometimes we try to think about the future, like what's going to happen in the future, but this is it. This is the future. This is it. This is people connecting from many different faiths. So I just wanted to point that out in case we'd forgotten.
Do you want to make a 2-second comment
2 seconds. Okay, so my name's Ryan Harb. I came here from Amherst, Massachusetts, and the church I go to is First Congregational Church in Amherst, and also go back to Andover. My grandmother is 95. She's at West Paris Congregational Church. She just sang in the choir for the first time after breaking her arm the other day, so bless her. So my comment is, for a number of years, I actually wasn't going to church, but I've been involved in the environmental movement since my early 20s. I'm 29 now. And one of the things that actually brought me back is someone showed me the divestment the UCC has made, and that got me so excited. And just as someone coming from the environmental movement, and just hearing about the unpack your or pack your bag sermon, those are actually the things that get me really excited. And in the circles I run in, I think a lot of young people too. And so when I go to church now, someone who's coming in, only been going back for probably under a year now, I don't see many young people who are around, at least in the UCC and Amherst. And I think it's those pack your bag sermon that might actually draw some young people back into it. And so for me, I just wanted to say it's kind of an unpack your bags sermon. It's like I'm staying.
Nice.
It's like, I want to be there.
That's good.
And just also the truth that's being spoken in this room today is just, it's like, I feel like I haven't gone to conferences very much for the past 5 years. I've been just very much involved as a leader. And I feel so excited, and just there's so much truth in this room right now. So just, and wisdom from everyone up here. Thank you all, and just everyone in the audience too. So this is awesome, guys. Thank you.
You're terrific on the range for what you said, which is
Sir Martin Rees last night who was the Royal Astronomer speaking on the other side of campus, pointed to the key fact that I think gets to Tim's point. In order to survive the Anthropocene, we have to transcend anthropocentrism.
Yeah.
And that's a huge theological problem. Because it's not just next generations, it's creation.
And with that,